All right, everyone. I have to say, I'm really excited to sit down with Andrew from Religion for Breakfast. Andrew, let me just, well, I told you already, I'm going to embarrass you. So here
All right,
goes,
let's
be
go for it.
prepared. Um, Folks, this guy's a trailblazer. I mean, when I say that, I really am serious. The building up of academic educational scholarly content on YouTube. I mean, there's a kind of period in which that just didn't exist, and it was really just a complete vacuum. And folks like Andrew and Jackson Crawford and other folks have come in and really paved the way for, I think, providing amazing high quality educational material in religious studies, which is prone to the worst kind of abuses on the internet. Um, and Andrew's really paved the way with Religion for Breakfast. And I will say that I will express my personal thanks because it was watching your channel and realizing this guy is really making high quality stuff, and maybe I could add my voice to that. And insofar as I've been able to do that, I think it's really on the heels of your very, very warranted success. And so I just want to say thank you on behalf of myself and other religious studies scholars who are now on YouTube, but also on behalf of all the viewers, the folks here that are, have really benefited from the years of work that you've done. So, Andrew, I really appreciate you, and I appreciate your scholarship, and I appreciate doing the hard work of making stuff that can be so inaccessible. Valentinian ontology,
Yeah.
stuff that can be so inaccessible, accessible to the general public. I just want to thank you for that service.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you for the kind words. I mean, I started my channel 7 years ago. Like, I didn't really realize that until a few months ago. It was October 2021. I was like, oh man, like my the 7th year anniversary is coming up. Like, I've been YouTubing for a long time. And 7 years ago, just like you said, there was no religious studies content on YouTube. I shouldn't say no. There were, Crash Course might post a video on religion here and there,
Right.
but there was no channel dedicated to the academic study of religion. And I was in the midst of my PhD program, and I was loving it. Some people hate their graduate school experience every single day. I was like, I can't believe I'm doing this every day. This is fun. Like, I got to share this somehow.
Yeah.
And at the time, I was such a huge fan of Crash Course, SciShow, like a lot of these OG educational YouTube channels. And I was like, okay, every single major discipline has the YouTube channel. There's a physics channel, there's an astronomy channel, there's an archaeology channel. Where's the religious studies channel? So I'm like, I could try to be that channel. So I kind of just started it on a whim, and it's been growing ever since. So it's inspiring to hear that it inspired you. That's really cool.
Yeah, it has a huge impact. Yeah, and you're almost 500,000 subscribers. And again, I think we can. I don't know about you, but sometimes I think we can get lost in the drive to get subscribers and Patreon supporters. And of course, we need all that stuff to keep the lights on. But I just think about that's 450,000 people, at least theoretically, that are better informed because what you do exists.
Yeah.
And I just in a world in which religious studies education is so poor.
Mhm.
That the
It
fact
shows
that you're doing
it shows there's a market for it. Like, people,
absolutely.
I remember I went to like an entrepreneur meetup in Boston a few years ago, and I was trying to market myself. I'm like this digital humanities guy, online educator, and I was like pitching my channel to somebody, and they're like, "Oh, I'm not religious, so I wouldn't like that channel, but my brother's religious. He might like it." And I was like, no, you don't have to be religious to like religious studies. Like, you haven't yet discovered that religion is one of the most interesting topics you can possibly study. So it's for, I feel like a lot of the mission of Religion for Breakfast is just to like, hey, you can study this academically, and it's really fascinating. So it's just trying to it's like this baseline religious literacy, not just being literate about religious traditions, but just knowing that the discipline exists and that you can study it.
No, and this is, I think, that one of the bizarre things that I think both of us face when we sort of sit in between the popular education world and the academic world. And there's a line we can sort of get told by at least administrators that, oh, there's not enough interest in religious studies to have a department. And I'm like, do you know about people in real life
Yeah.
who are desperately interested?
And look at every single corner of culture, whether it's politics or art or society, every single corner of culture, religion is implicated. And that yet we're shuttering religious studies departments at universities. I'm like, oh wow, you want to shutter that university with this international crisis happening? You want to shutter that department when like this policy thing from the Supreme Court just came down? Like, every single corner of culture still is implicated by religion, even though there's this idea of increasing secularization in the 21st century. I'm like, well, we should probably know a thing or two about religion if it's still this major force in society.
Right, and also a major force for tremendous good, but also tremendous evil. I mean,
Yeah,
it's just
like
that
the whole
religious.
gamut of human experience.
Exactly, and I really just find it that bizarre when I hear administrators at the university say, "Ah, we can't really justify a religious studies scholar," and this is in Michigan, where we have one of the most diverse religious areas in the Midwest. And I'm like,
Yeah.
there is literally no religious studies department at the largest urban university in Detroit. I'm like,
Wow.
it's bizarre.
Yeah.
It's bizarre, but we're trying to beat back the ignorance and
The illiteracy.
the religious literacy, and provide the expertise that we do. And I'm really glad again for the trailblazing work you've done. And yeah, so I want to ask you a question before since I'm the host of this dang
Yeah,
thing.
go ahead.
I want to ask you a question before we get to some of the super chats. And I saw one super chat already came in, and I want to make sure to acknowledge all those. But what's your favorite kind of video to make? We know what gets the clicks. We know what will, we kind of have to play to the algorithm sometimes, but I can definitely tell you that some of the videos I know that I think will do well, then they do. And I'm like, I'm not that interested in that. But sometimes I make videos and they do badly. And I'm like, that was my baby. Like, I
Yeah.
really loved making that episode on Heidevich or something like that.
Yeah.
So what's your favorite? Which ones do you get fired up about to actually produce?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I have two answers to that. One is simply whatever is my research field. So I study early Christianity, late Roman religion. If I'm writing about the late Roman Empire, I'm happy. It's super interesting to write. There's no research fatigue. So that's why there's so much early Christianity on my channel. This is one of my constant battles, is to try to diversify the topics I cover. I'm like, okay, I've just launched a Buddhism series. Oh, but let's publish another early Christianity video. So my audience is very understandably chastises me. Okay, let's start getting some different content. So obviously that, but also like topics that you wouldn't necessarily think fit under the umbrella of religious studies. So I'm trying to think of a good example. So I have a video on how the Star Wars universe demonstrates what a canon is. So if we think about canonicity with like the New Testament, debating whether the book of Revelation should be in the canon or not, debating if the book of the Shepherd of Hermas should be in the canon or not. We kind of know what a canon is. It's like authoritative texts. We see canonicity play out in fandoms when like, oh, is this new comic book published by Lucasfilm or whatever, is this canon? And before the buyout from Disney back in whenever that was, 2014, there was a lot of canonicity debates over, is this video game canon? Is this cartoon that was published with like little input from George Lucas canon? So like a lot of things that we don't think are religious are still kind of deeply ingrained in human experience. So like traveling, like pilgrimage, for example, we think of pilgrimage as religiously motivated traveling. You travel to the Western Wall in Jerusalem, or what have you. But pilgrimage is kind of deeply ingrained even in so-called non-religious spaces. So I remember distinctly when the former CEO of Apple died, Steve Jobs, and I was in Philadelphia at the time at the University of Pennsylvania. And I kind of had this knee-jerk reaction. Oh, I should go to the Apple store and just see what's up. And I went there and people were putting votives in front of the Apple store. There was this old 1989 Mac placed in front of the Apple store, this 20-year-old computer just abandoned with a little Post-it note on it that said, "Thank you." I think that's religious. It's outside of what we would stereotypically call religious. But I'm like, this is a religiously motivated action. If we think of religion as something that people do. So that's the sort of video I like to post, is like, hey, you think this is a religious studies channel, but we're going to talk about like something that you might not expect in a religious studies classroom.
Right. And I think that religious studies has a unique ability to provide a perspective on those kinds of behaviors over and against other disciplines that are obviously important, like anthropology or sociology. So yeah, I think that that's a really interesting, like stuff with comic books and video games that show that not only is religious studies worth studying in sort of the more canonical, stuff, but also that this stuff has a real life well outside of,
that's why I sometimes
history.
avoid like more. I sometimes the adjective religious might be a little bit misleading. I use more targeted terms like votive offering, pilgrimage. Like these are things that we can kind of like pilgrimage is journeying to a special location. Votive offering is something that you leave behind, like a significant object you leave behind. In that case, it kind of expands outside of the stricture that is like the world religions.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great point. And yeah, it also can reveal to people that they're religious in some level, even though they think there might not be, that it's still downstream of a kind of religiosity. That sort of not a social religion, but that that Christianity and
or
things
like
this can survive.
American civil religion, for
Right.
example, where you view the American flag as a sacred object, stuff like that.
Right. All right. The apotheosis of George Washington. If you go to the National Archive, which is one of the most perplexing pieces of art.
I know, like Washington is like floating on a cloud, like enrobed. Yeah, I have an American civil religion series, and it didn't really perform well. So going back to the algorithm, like people weren't necessarily clicking on it, but I think the core audience of Religion for Breakfast were like, okay, I see what you're doing here. Like religion is like beyond, like it can sometimes be beyond our strict definition.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. What in the world was that dinging sound?
I don't know where that's coming from.
I don't either. And it stopped. That's weird. Okay. Strange. A voice from the gods.
Yes.
The gods speak in Morse code. So it's a great super chat from Jason. Dr. Henry's a true boss. Indeed, he is. We have 2/3 of the pieces of the puzzle. Dr. Lipva. I also want to bring him on the channel. And he does great work on early Christianity and published the Hermetica 2 volume.
Okay. Yeah, I've seen him a few times on the Myth Vision podcast. Haven't yet met him yet.
Yeah. I think he's in Australia.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah. So like he also has written a recent book also about the sort of evil god angle, really trying to get at some of the stuff of the early demiurgic traditions in the late classical world. I'm really interested in that. The ever-present curiosity about where that came from. Which is which I don't know about you. I've never seen a satisfactory answer.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the video ideas I've had for a long time, and just like demiurgical religious traditions, like where did the idea of the demiurge come from? Starting with Plato and just following it through until like Yazidi religion. Like there's still people around that have this demiurgical theology.
Right. And to me, what's I think the most fascinating is when that flip happened, that inversion, where it went from the Timaeus, who's doing the best with what they can, to like a straightforwardly evil deity, and just seeing where that mythology came from. That's really fascinating to me. Also want to acknowledge one of our friends, a shared friend of ours. Angela is also in the chat. It's great to see you, Angela. She's a wonderful person. I really love.
We did a collab, Angela and I, maybe a year or two ago, where we were talking about demonology. Great. This is what we're talking about. Like 7 years ago, there was no religious studies content, and now there's like Angela Symposium, Let's Talk Religion, Esoterica. Like there's a cohort now, which is kind of cool.
It really is cool, and I think it's nice because we all have our kind of angles, and I really look forward to seeing it. Seeing that grow, and it's just.
Well, it's funny. We do have our different angles, but like three of us, we focus on like, I mean, you, me, and Angela all kind of focus on like magic and esoteric and occult topics. Like, how did the few academic YouTubers that got into this field study the so-called occult? I think that's pretty interesting.
It's interesting, but I think what turns out to be interesting as well is that while I do dip a little bit back into late classical world, I mostly hang out in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and Angela's much more toward the contemporary world. So in that way, it's a very complementary kind of thing. But of course, I always want to dip back to whatever Gnosticism or something like that. So it's fun that we can overlap in those ways. And also because we come at it in different angles. My training is actually in philosophy. And so because I come at it from that angle, that creates a different tenor of content than if we were to both do episodes on Valentinianism, which I think we have. It comes out actually quite different in the wash. So the people who are interested in Valentinianism are going to get a different take from both.
I'm much more archaeological and anthropologically trained. Like my PhD is in religious studies, but I kind of focused on the materiality of religion. And so because of that, I'm like always talking about rituals. So like the Valentinian episode, I'm like, we're going to talk about Valentinian cosmology, sure, but like let's talk about the rituals at the end. Like we can't forget this, because I'm always interested in the materiality. And sometimes like I'm not really trained in philosophy. So I was watching your live stream the other day and you really started talking philosophy. I'm like, oh man, this is beyond me. Like, let's talk about like what crops people grew and what magical rituals they did to help those crops grow. Like it's just very much like on the ground, small scale ritual.
And I really appreciate that. I mean, I'm a, a historical materialist in my philosophical upbringing, and so I'm always also thinking about like, where are the calories? Like, how did this person, make enough money, and how do they fit into the economy? I love the amulets that have the blank space. There's an amulet copied several times, and
Yeah.
then holes punched in it, and the blank space is left for the name. And like, it's like
There was an industry.
There's an industry. Yeah, it's like
Yeah.
not a cottage industry. This was like a
Well, I allude to that in our video today.
Mhm.
So we did a collaboration on Jesus the magician or miracle workers and the ancient Eastern Mediterranean, and I allude to it very briefly. But like a lot of what we call magical, like talisman and incantation bowls and curse tablets, they probably were made in specialized workshops, especially
Oh
like
yeah,
these gems. Like if anybody has seen like a Roman gem, like they are absolutely intricately carved. So
and
you're not
tiny.
it's absolutely tiny too.
Yeah,
So it's not like any Joe Schmo could just like pick up, make a gem. Like you probably had to go to
right,
the workshop and be like, "Hey, I really want a Gnostic gem to help protect me from demons. Like, what can you do for me?" Like, I have just the
right,
thing. So like that's, and again with the whole idea of like, oh, magic was occult, secret. Like it wasn't. It was out in the open. Like we have temples. There's a temple outside of Corinth to the goddess Demeter, where there were curse tablets being deposited in the temple that were probably being made by the priestesses there. So it was like it
right.
was part of their official duties. So every time someone says, "Well, the Roman law code said don't do magic," I'm like, "Well, they were not working because here are like
Right,
a
and
bunch of official temples."
right, and just like in the Hebrew Bible, where the Roman law codes say don't do it, that's telling us that people are doing it. You don't
Mhm.
pass you don't pass laws for something that isn't happening typically.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I tend to agree that this was a much more. I mean, just and also also we're going to getting a glimpse into a tiny social stratum, right? The kind of person that could commission that gem
Right.
is only telling us about a tiny, tiny sliver of the population. So it's hard to say like it's how widespread this was, but we have tons of them that survive.
Yeah. One of the
Um,
objects I mentioned in today's video is a 37-centimeter long silver amulet that was rolled up and probably like worn as a necklace. And I'm like, who's buying a
yeah,
37-centimeter long piece of silver? A super rich person. And it
yeah,
seems to
of course.
be a protective formula for their daughter. Like you can just picture this like wealthy couple going to the local silversmith and taking the piece of silver to the local bishop and saying, "Hey, give me like a really good, very Christiany protective formula." And I'm using the word formula instead of spell because like as soon as I say spell, it biases our interpretation of the
No,
object.
right, right, and yeah, I love the Coptic, quote unquote
Mm,
magical spells that really show that even in the period of sort of Coptic Orthodoxy or the rise of Coptic
mhm.
Christianity, that this was still ubiquitous in society,
Yeah.
even in the monastery level.
Yeah, like
Uh,
The so-called Greek magical papyri. Like the word magical papyri has just stuck because that's like what the original
right,
publishers called it back in the early 20th century. But these were being made by Egyptian priests as part of their priestly duties.
mhm.
Like this whole idea that like magic's like this subset of religion that's secretly happening in basements. It's just not. It doesn't bear out in the archaeology.
No, and it doesn't. I mean, and even in the Middle Ages, it doesn't really bear out because the only people that we know that could be doing the ritual expert that would have the ritual expertise to do the kinds of things we call necromancy are exactly the only people or priests.
Yeah.
It's part of it's baked into into the culture, and I think that yeah, that sharp distinction is it just says more about us and how we've inherited a discourse around
Hmm. Yeah.
religion and magic as these opposing things, but for
Yeah.
most of human history, that was definitely not a thing. Um, let's super chat. Any plans for future pop culture episodes? Thinking about the Sandman series with magic circles and dreams and religion. Yeah, I'm also looking forward to the Sandman series and thinking about maybe some of that. I think you're a lot better at sort of keeping a field of pop culture and really tapping into that. Your recent video with Hansu and
Hmm.
stuff like that. But any other pop culture stuff coming up
Yeah,
that
I mean,
you?
I'm kind of a basic bro when it comes to Marvel. I like Marvel.
Mhm.
So I did a Loki video, I did a Khonshu video. So you can expect more Marvel from me in the future. I'm an absolute Star Wars nerd, so I'll
Mhm.
eventually do like a video like, is Mandalorianism a religion? I'm also a huge Nintendo fan. So one of my favorite
Mhm.
videos I ever made was like, what is Mario's religion? Super
Oh,
Mario.
that's a great, yeah.
And everyone
Star
was like,
worship.
well, he's obviously Catholic because he's from Italy. I'm like, well, no, like if we use the video games as our primary data, he was worshiping like these astral deities. And it's just completely absurd, but it's just kind of like, here's what religious studies methodology could look like with fictional primary sources.
Right. And I think that's a really interesting, especially with Caitlin's work and thinking about how the uptake of even Western religion and
Mhm.
even Western occultism into anime is something I'm really interested in working with her on. We chatted about it briefly, and thinking about how Full Metal Alchemist is taking
Mhm.
medieval European alchemical ideas and importing them into an anime environment. That kind of
Yeah.
artistic syncretism is fascinating.
Yeah, and for those in the audience that don't know, we're talking about Caitlin Ugoritz, who's a scholar of Japanese religion. She has a channel called Eat, Pray, Anime. Huge fan. She actually helped. She was the main writer and researcher of my Shintoism series on my channel. So excellent scholar.
Yeah, she's great. And again, another great scholar I'm glad to have on the platform. Robert Herring also, thank you, buddy, for super sticker. Yeah, and folks, yeah, feel free to use the super chat. We'll definitely get to super chat questions. I can't guarantee you we'll get to all of them, but we'll definitely get to the super chat ones because they literally keep the lights on. More than you guys might think. Let me jump up to some other topics. What other kind of things you got coming down the pike, Andrew, that you're willing to reveal?
Yeah, I mean, I have a few videos on like the evolution of religion that are already filmed and ready to go. Like I've recently become like super interested in like cognitive evolution, and I know like cognitive evolution is kind of sometimes made fun of as kind of like, you know, not super empirical. It's a lot of scientists just trying to imagine what the Pleistocene human was like. So I have a video on like the origin of religious music, like what music did back in like 100,000 BC
Right.
to bring communities together. I have a video that is more on religious studies theory, coming out of the anthropologist Roy Rappaport. So I'm very excited about those two videos because they are a little bit different from stuff I've done in the past. I've done a little bit of cognitive evolution on my channel. I have a video titled "Is Religion Biologically Hardwired?" That kind of digs into the Pleistocene mind, as it were. So that's kind of what I'm most excited about.
Yeah, those are really interesting questions. I mean, I've wanted to also do an episode on, and I from watching Westworld and in my religious studies background when we read the Bicameral Mind, which I don't know that I believe it, but it is one of the most interesting hypotheses for the sort of the axial age proximity to the gods. For folks who don't know this theory, it's a theory that was put forward in the 20th century that claims basically that the brain changed and that prior to that the mind was bicameral. The actual corpus callosum was much strongerly attached, and that people literally heard the voices of the gods inside their head. And there was a brain talking to them. And I've often found this interesting, and it has interesting, in Westworld, it really had interesting ramifications. And yeah, so I want to do an episode about that, but it's one of those things where I'm not quite sure it's really in the wheelhouse of the channel.
Yeah, I've dug recently into what's called gene culture coevolution, which is like our genetic evolution influenced how, you know, we act, like our culture. But then once culture started developing, it kind of fed back in a feedback loop to then influence our genes. And the one example being like cooking our food. Like the more we were cooking our food, the more our digestive tract kind of adapted to want to have cooked food. So in the same way, like religious music, beliefs about so-called non-obvious beings like spirits and gods and demons, like started to feed back into how like our mind actually like anthropomorphizes objects. It's just really interesting once you get into like the evolution of religion. There's a scholar, he's an evolutionary biologist at Harvard University named Joseph Henrich, who just he focuses almost entirely on religion. Absolutely fascinating research. I just can't put his stuff down. It's really interesting.
That's really fascinating. Yeah, I mean, it would also be interesting to touch on, sort of what we know about Paleolithic religion. It's a dangerous place to wade into because the data games. It's guessing games, right? But we have grave goods and the cairns inside the caves with the bear skulls on them at like a Chauvet cave, and seeing. I mean, it's weird to see that at Chauvet cave with the bear skull on top of that cairn and see something just like that in the Galilee. That's roughly 40,000. Within the same world. And of course, the bear cult stuff, I think that got put out there in the mid 20th century. I think that's probably a little too strong.
I'm pretty sure it's been either disputed or discredited. But
I'm not sure I'm buying it. I'm not sure I'm buying it either. But it is just conspicuous. This that kind of stuff. But it's an interesting thing, and one wonders when you see this kind of intentionality.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to look at religion through an evolutionary lens because it kind of reminds us that religion is something people do. So pilgrimages, votive offerings, speaking to invisible beings. So like these are things that humans do, and it gets kind of almost retroactively lumped under this term religion. Like they, obviously the Paleolithic humans weren't calling it religion. It's we modern scholars that say, this is religion. We're going to categorize it as such. But this stuff kind of evolved independent from the institutions that we now call religious.
Right. It's a good question for you, Andrew, from Lady Longsleeves, who's a big supporter of the channel. Any plans on making episodes on Orthodox Christianity?
Yeah, I mean, I'll more specifically, I'm going to be making a video on Coptic Orthodox Christianity pretty soon.
That's I was hoping you were going to say that, because the Coptic Orthodoxy they have my favorite headgear of any of the
Yeah.
of any of the religions. I love Coptic Orthodox headgear.
Yeah. For those that don't know, I was completing a postdoc research fellowship in Egypt for the past year. So I have tons and tons of like on the ground footage from Coptic Orthodox monasteries, churches. So like I just have the footage. Like I need to do something with this like 20 gigabytes of like 4K footage from like top Orthodox Coptic Orthodox sites. So yeah, that's probably the next on the docket. I don't know if I'll get around to Greek Orthodoxy or Russian Orthodoxy in the near future, but at least for Coptic Orthodoxy, it's fresh in my mind. The footage is there. I'm super interested in the topic, so that's probably coming sometime this year.
Did your Coptic ever get good enough that you could understand any of the liturgy? I mean, I know it's Boheric and not Sahidic, which I think we typically study Sahidic and not Boheric, but
yeah, so never did the Boheric.
yeah.
And you know, the sort of stuff I translate for my research is usually just a few lines. You know, like one of the chapters of my dissertation was literally like one line inscriptions that people inscribed on their door lintels. So like I feel like my ancient language atrophied somewhat by the time I was writing my dissertation, because I was never sitting down and reading like big chunks at a time. So short answer, no. But if you handed me a nice short magical formula from 6th century Egypt, I got you covered.
Yeah. And I guess this is an interesting question. The ones that are occurring more in the Christian milieu, are they being written in Boheric, or are they written in?
No, not really. I mean, later they are. I mean, a lot of these so-called magical formularies from like the 9th and 10th centuries are, but most of the stuff I deal with in like the 4th, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th centuries is Sahidic.
Sahidic, yeah. Just so folks know, there are different dialects of Coptic, like in many languages, and they're recognizably different. I mean, it really is the case that competency in one doesn't completely translate into competency in the other. And most famously, the Nag Hammadi library is primarily written in the Sahidic, sort of the classical language of Coptic. And the Boheric, another dialect, was the dialect eventually that became the standard dialect of the Coptic Orthodox Church. So that's kind of what we're talking about.
Yeah, now that we're talking about that, I have an intro to Coptic coming up probably next month. That's already filmed and edited. So
intro to Coptic language.
As a language, yeah. As like a liturgical language, yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's really cool. It's another great thing about doing this channel is that it's actually given me opportunities to go back and revisit, you know, Coptic. It's one of those languages where like, oh yeah, I took a semester of it in undergrad, or, over the summer or whatever, and I was like, oh yeah, I nearly beef that up. And so it's a great opportunity to beef up your ancient language game, and then be made fun of by everybody in the comments about how you pronounce anything.
I know. I'm constantly, you know, like you're taught like Erasmian pronunciation Greek and grad school, and so Greek speakers in the comments are always like, "Oh my God, your Greek is so bad." I'm like, I know, but it's different from modern Greek, but also like we're not even taught how the ancient people actually were saying it. Like by the time Koine Greek was rolling around, some of those vowels had already changed, and yet we're still doing like 5th century BC pronunciations. It's a mess.
It's a mess. Yeah, it's the same with academic Hebrew or other academic languages. Like that the way that I would use a Hebrew word, like talking in my house with my family, is completely different than the way I would use Hebrew in like an academic setting.
Yeah.
And the academic Hebrew is completely made up. No one talks like that.
Yeah. Same with ancient Egyptian. Like some people got really mad at me in the Kansu video because I say Re instead of Ra, and Re is more the Coptic pronunciation. And I'm like, well, that's what a lot of scholars say, Re instead of Ra. So I'm sorry that the sun god, he was probably neither, but Re is closer to how the Coptic speakers said it.
Oh, right. I mean, Egyptian hieroglyphics is just like the vowels there. It's an enormous debate. I think the eagle shaped one that's usually just 3 hashes. Like no one has any idea what that sounded like.
Yeah. And like, I mean, when you're doing this research, you're not pronouncing the words. Like, unless you're teaching it in a classroom, like which I didn't during my dissertation. I didn't teach any classes except for like 2 semesters, and like I'm just reading it on a page. So like I think a lot of scholars out there, they have like the head knowledge of the language, but they don't really pronounce it. They don't know how to speak it. It's just kind of a research language.
No, same deal with me. If I have to, it was funny. I was making an episode about something on Coptic. I think it was some Nag Hammadi library related thing, and I wanted to read the Coptic, and I was like, hold on, I'm not even sure how this is said. Like the R sound, for instance. There's just a ton of debate about just what the R sound was in Coptic, and it's interesting.
I think the Lycopolitan dialect switched the R with the L or something like that. Like there's actually like entire consonant swaps in some of these dialects.
Right, and RL swaps are not uncommon. There's several languages that sort of those letters live in between each other. Here's a question I know we can't answer, but we can throw some spaghetti at it. NK, thank you for the super chat. Dr. Sledgehammer. I do like, you may appreciate this, Andrew, that one of my favorite compliments is that I was told one time that Dr. Sledge sounds like a Marvel supervillain from the 1970s.
It really does, yeah.
Yeah, so I was like, that's the best compliment I've ever gotten. Could you please define what magic is exactly? Andrew, you can have this one. It seems like the higher potentiality of what humans can be or achieve, nothing supernatural, just what a life filled with awareness and intentionality is.
Yeah. So short answer is scholars have not settled on a good definition. Like I actually have a spreadsheet in my note-taking app. Every single time I come across a scholar trying to define magic, I put it into my spreadsheet. And of the dozens that I've recorded, they're not the same. Like scholars, like a lot of times they define magic as like, this is how I'm using it in this book. But like a set defined, this is what magic is. No one has come up with the definitive definition. I will say that doesn't mean it's impossible to define religion or magic. It's just there's 100 different definitions, some of which are terrible, some of which are really good. Right. So I'm going to start with a terrible definition. A lot of people are like, oh, well, magic is it's something that's done by an individual, while religion is something that's like done by a higher being. So like Jesus's miracles are not magic because it's done by God, not by the charisma of the actor. And to that, I'm like, well, look at these dozens and dozens of curse tablets that say, like the goddess Sulis, please do this for me. Like, but it's on a curse tablet, therefore it's magic. So like you can just come up with plenty of formularies that are calling upon a higher power and not relying on the individual specialist. Some way, magic is exotic and religion is not, to which I'm like, that's subjective. And sometimes, sometimes so-called magic is not exotic at all. So the number of amulets that we've discovered that use the Lord's Prayer, for example, I mean, that's as religious as it gets. Literally hundreds of millions of Christians chant it every single Sunday, but they also rolled it up into a little talisman that you could wear around your neck. So those are some bad definitions. Some better definitions, there's a scholar named Andrew Wilburn. I believe he's at Oberlin College. He's written a really good book called Materia Magica, which is kind of like the archaeology of magic in the Roman world. He comes up with like this like step-by-step definition. It's like magic is mechanistic ritual that draws from religious texts and materials, that's often personal instead of communal, that's deployed for like a specific crisis or something like that, something to be done, whether it's turn invisible or curse somebody. You can just poke holes in any definition though. I'm like, well, there's mechanistic ritual and religious contexts that are trying to do something, complete something. And here are plenty of examples of magic that are very communal. So there's a big inscription in the city of Miletus, which is in Western Turkey, that was like carved into the side of the theater in the city that was like, protect the city of Miletus. And it calls upon the archangels. Archangels, protect our city. And there's like little amulets drawn on the block. This is a super public so-called magical inscription in the center of the city. So that's communal and not private. So all this to say, the people that have tried to come up with what I consider like an outsider academic definition, they usually fall apart under scrutiny. My dissertation advisor, David Frankfurter, who's a professor of early Christianity at Boston University, says that we can more easily use the word magic as an adjective to talk about the quality of a ritual or an object, a quality of its potency or its charisma. So you can say, well, a magical use of the Lord's Prayer would be, chanting it as the plane is crashing so it doesn't crash, or a magical use of like crossing yourself as you enter a dangerous space. It's talking about the quality of the ritual for its potency, and it's how you're applying it to like a specific crisis. I'm he was my dissertation advisor, so I'm generally convinced by his arguments. So I like using magical as like a qualifier, but not to talk about a specific subset of ritual, because the data set is just too big. There's just too many things that we call magic.
Right. And that's the way I think about this problem too, is it's theory in relationship to data, right? That good
Yeah.
theories cover maximal data. And the way I think about it is I take my lead from philosophy of science, that in philosophy of science, they talk about low resolution and high resolution theory.
Mm.
And that a high resolution theory is really specific, but it covers only a very small data set, right? And so, but it covers that data set very, very well, right?
Mm.
A low resolution theory covers a lot more data, but there's all kinds of exceptions to it.
Yeah.
And so I think that what I think in terms of magic, and this is true of religion and a lot of the terms we have to deal with, is that they're mostly low resolution terms. If we want to give a big definition, and that means they're going to be inherently vague, and that the higher resolution we want, it's only going to cover an increasingly small data set until eventually you're in a pretty narrow data set.
Yeah.
And so it's only going to cover, magic in the European environment in the 12th through 15th century or something. And even then, not well. And so I think that when I think about talking about magic, I don't want to go the more Foucauldian discursive analysis path. I tend to be much more in the philosophy of science world that way. And I'd rather talk about low resolution, high resolution theories. And there's a great book out called Defining Magic. It's like a 300-page attempt by lots of scholars to do that. And I'm like, look, I think we could think about this in terms of low resolution, high resolution. And if you want to really get a good definition of medieval necromantic magic, that's going to be a super high resolution theory, but it's going to tell you basically nothing about what they're doing over in Egypt.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the dialectic, right? I think to me, that's how I think about it. And that's why I think that you can't get a general definition of magic that has a sufficiently high resolution to actually be terribly powerful.
I really like this bifurcation between high resolution and low resolution, because it gives me some vocabulary to explain something that I've noticed what scholars do, and what I do myself actually is to use more high def terms. So instead of saying this is magic, this is magic, this is magic, I say, okay, this is cursing, this is exorcism, this is healing, this is protecting. So like using more focused words. So when I say, okay, this is an exorcistic ritual, it's like, okay, we're dealing with demonological beings, we're dealing with removing those beings from a person or a space. So it's like a much more high def term describing a much more discrete subset of rituals. And sometimes there's overlap. So what's the real difference between what's called an apotropaic ritual, so a ritual that's supposed to ward something away, and an exorcism? Sometimes an exorcism is like preemptive, trying to ward something away. So there is some overlap. So something I do in my own research is I almost never use the term magic. I use much more discrete terms like cursing, exorcism, healing, protecting. And then I'll occasionally use magical as an adjective to talk about the quality of a ritual, like something that's trying to manipulate ritual power.
Right. That makes a lot of sense to me. And I think this is also another way we could think about, problematic categories like Gnosticism.
Yeah.
Where
or religion.
Or religion, right. That, these kinds of categories at really low resolution, they're useful for the cover of a book.
Yeah,
or a conversation, but they're not really usful once you drill down into any data.
Well, the topic of the title of my video is Jesus a magician? And most of the video is spent like, let's get rid of the word magician. So I'm sure I'm going to get some viewers that are pretty upset about that.
No, for sure. And it's also funny, right? Because the live reality too is that no matter, you can write an entire book about how whatever thing you're working on isn't magic, and the publisher's going to put the word magic on the title.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So that's funny, but we're going to call this Coptic magic, and you're like, because we have to sell your.
We have to sell books. Yeah, it's just all marketing, optics.
Yeah. So I know, NK, that's not a super great definition because we didn't give you one, but I think that at least we were able to talk about how we can use the same kind of language in a more precise way, and why the imprecision exists.
And I guess if you really want a hard and fast definition, try to use Andrew Wilburn's, but I would just say, user beware. Every definition like that is going to have holes.
But I think that, the high resolution, the less it covers. And you can't, and except for in dissertations, right, where you can really drill down into 5 amulets maybe, and then you can probably say there is something we can talk about that defines the magic of these 5 things. But bigger than that, it begins to break down. Here's a fun one.
Oh yeah.
Nathaniel Smith, £5. Thank you. Is QAnon a religion?
Yeah, 100%. I've thought about this a lot, and I actually have a whole QAnon video planned, and I'm terrified to post it because it's gonna, it's an extremist movement, first of all. So the people that study QAnon, they call it an extremist movement, and it's led to actual violence. But I think it's thoroughly religious. Apocalypticism, messianism, the idea of like resurrected beings, like JFK Jr. is actually alive, like a being that went into occultation who's now back on the scene. 100% a religious movement. But like, how do we qualify it? Is it a politico-religious movement? Like, it's obviously deeply intertwined with American politics. But I always say,
as religion tends to be, actually.
Yeah, for sure.
That's not, and also kind of this Gnostic stuff too, with the Q drops, and you have to decipher them. And there's a kind of it's a highly esoteric religion as well.
Yeah, exactly. You're trying to like interpret these esoteric comments from this mysterious figure. I guess I would just say, like, again, using religious as an adjective, like saying this is a religion, therefore raises like, okay, what do you mean by religion? But I would say, this is religious or religion-ish, because there's aspects in it that we see in things that we call more stereotypically religious, like apocalypticism, messianism, occultation, stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think this is, again, I'm going to keep banging the gavel of why religious studies matters. I think about the QAnon, and I would say cult, and I use the word cult not in the pejorative sense, but in the religious sense, that there is a kind of, it's like the Imperial cult. It has a kind of, there's a Messiah and there's these things. And I think failure to understand it from a religious studies angle, given that it is prone to violence, that's a place where religious studies scholars need to be working directly with people and policymakers. And I think that the thing that jumps to my mind always is David Koresh, and how in the situation with David Koresh, the negotiator was working directly with a religious studies scholar and said, you need to stop the X, Y, and Z, because that is actually, you're creating the environment for their apocalypse. And how that went off the rails. And like, that's a place where religious studies could have, I think, concretely saved lives.
So I'm pulling up a scholar right now. His name is Marc-Andre Argentino. He's a scholar. He studies QAnon, and he's like a sociologist, I believe, and he comes at it completely from a religious studies perspective. So if you really want to, and he focuses on online extremism in general, but Marc-Andre Argentino, excellent scholar. I read everything he publishes, and a lot of my upcoming QAnon video is drawing from his research.
Yeah, I think it's super important. This is a great question, and I think it just shows why we need religious studies scholars, and also why those scholars need to be public and interacting with policymakers, and sometimes even with like law enforcement and negotiations and things like that.
But also like religious studies is sometimes ugly. I think a lot of people romanticize religion, like, oh, it's this search for truth, and I'm like, well, sometimes it's just like violence and partisanship, like, and you kind of have to have both under the umbrella of religious studies: the people that study the sublime poetry of Rumi, and the people that study like extremist fascist movements in the 21st century.
Are the same kind of movements back in the past. I think that with the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think that
are sectarian documents.
Sectarian documents, highly sectarian, and apocalyptic, and I think maybe had only survived because I think that those people marched off to battle and never came back at some level. So Gnostic Informant, hey buddy, another great YouTuber working on interfacing with scholars and making scholarship available to the YouTube audience. So thank you so much for the super chat. Anything coming up soon on the Roman Imperial cult for either of you? Now, this is close to Neil's heart.
I will say not in the immediate future. I have a video on mystery religions coming up, like maybe in the next 3 or 4 months, which tangentially is related to that, but nothing that's like specifically Imperial cult. I will say one of my favorite sites I've ever visited is called the Sabastion in Aphrodisias, Turkey. So it's like southwestern Asia Minor, which is like this amazing temple to the Imperial cult that has all these like basically relief sculptures of Rome or the emperor like conquering the provinces. So like, talk about really visceral, like I'm all about the archaeology, and this is this very visceral temple to the Imperial cult. So if I ever were to do a video on that, it would be on the Sabastion in Aphrodisias.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't have anything coming up on it either, although it's a thing that I'd love to work with Angela actually about, a sort of Roman religion and thinking about sort of local cults, and because I think Angela's made this point, and I think she is really right about this, and is that the way we can get trapped into thinking about ancient religions in a completely, like as if they're versions of Protestantism or something in the ancient world, and thinking about like what I would call like metaphysical multiplicity. which is say these gods sort of are unified in some sense, but also exist distinctly in lots of places. And yeah, I think about that a lot. But yeah, it'd be interesting to think about that and sort of the divinity of Caesar and and also how that dovetails very much with early Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, it's a topic I'm reasonably familiar with, considering my research on late Roman religion. It's just not something that's on the docket. You know, I have to finish the Coptic video and have to finish the evolution of religion video. So
No,
I'm
yeah,
sure you understand it's an endless hamster wheel of
no.
trying
Do you
to
have
finish
do you also have the pile of books that represent the various projects that you're working on? And
you know what? I counted recently. I have 35 video scripts already written
wow.
that need to still be filmed. 35. How am I going to film all those? Even if I do 3 videos a month, you know, it's like 10 months. Like anyway, so
We call that job security, Andrew.
I have a huge backlog.
That's great. I mean, that's a good problem to have, though.
Mm.
I mean, basically, what I do every week is I just sort of look at my shelves and go,
Today we're doing this.
Yeah, today, yeah, it's like whatever grabs my interest, which is also one of the great things about sort of the line of work that we do, that at some level we can kind of go with our interests. Whereas, you know, if you're working on a monograph, well, you're in monograph territory for the next 2-3 years. Whereas, you know, I can go pick up whatever, you know, I'm really interested in Ugaritic religion, you know, the past month. And so I'm reading one of the great SBL books where they published all of the ritual texts that were recovered from Ugarit, along with magical texts and other kinds of divinatory texts, which also just gives an interesting vision of the Canaanite religion. It's our only glimpse, really, of a very small sliver of Canaanite religion, but still the precursor to the, you know, the Israelite world, at least.
Yeah,
some level.
I feel bad for Bronze Age archaeologists because they have so little data to work with. I've traveled a lot around Jerusalem, in the West Bank and Israel. Like every time I came across an Iron Age and Bronze Age site, it's like a pile of rocks. I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. Because when I visit a late Roman site like Beit Shan in northern Israel, it's like huge pillars are still preserved. The whole stadium is still preserved. And so there's just so little data to work with. And sometimes like your knowledge of something like Canaanite religion is like super influenced by this one giant discovery.
Yeah, man. Yeah. And not just that, but the amount of extrapolation and how fierce the competition over, you know, if you get one mention of a new mention of a god on a publication, you're a rock star. And also people are rushed to judgment and flub that stuff up all the time with this. Yeah. As we both know from this new
this curse tablet from Mount Ebal.
Yeah, that God knows what's on that thing.
I haven't heard yet. I'm waiting for the peer-reviewed article. I'm not waiting for the press release.
Yeah, I'm going to wait for St. Rolston to tell me what to believe about it.
Oh man, it's just like the worst example of rushing something to the. There's that dinging noise again. Rushing something to a press release instead of a unpublished article.
Yeah, that's weird.
All right. I think it's gone. I can't hear you right now. Did you mute yourself?
Yeah, turn it back on. So yeah, something outside my house, actually. I think that they're like hammering. They're literally hammering on something. They're driving something into the ground. The dangers of live streaming. It's a good one. Summer book recommendation. Anything that you'd recommend for the audience that you would?
Yes. I'm Googling it real fast because I forget the title. Let's see.
I can give one just if folks are, especially folks who are interested in manuscripts. Brian Nogri's book, God's Library, is a great book about early Christian books as archaeological objects. And we often forget that the first pieces of archaeological evidence we have of Christianity are manuscripts, are actual books. And looking at the discovery of those books and how they got published and how they, you know, etc. So it's a really interesting deep dive that's still pretty accessible to a non-specialist audience, especially for people who are curious about how their New Testament became a New Testament. Is really, and it's also like kind of Indiana Jones-ish. This is another thing also that I think people don't really realize is how absolutely shady that entire world was and is of manuscript finds and dissemination. Yeah. So that's a great book. The Nogri book of God's Library is a great one.
So I finally tracked it down. So the book is called How God Becomes Real. How God Becomes Real by I think she's an anthropologist, Tanya Luhrmann. That's Luhrmann.
Tanya Luhrmann, she did the great book on witchcraft.
Yeah. So she is Absolutely amazing. The book How God Becomes Real talks about how humans, you know, do certain mental processes and physical processes that we call rituals to make our gods, our spirits, to be more real to us,
Hmm.
because they're counterintuitive ideas. Like, for many Christians, you don't like physically see God. Like, God is this concept, you pray to him. We talk about God the Father as this being, but she makes this argument that humans kind of need ritual and need to like pay attention to keep the concept of God real in their head. It's like this absolutely fascinating social psychological study. It's very readable. I think she kind of wrote it for a public audience in mind. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying about like how talking about the evolution of religion can really kind of like make you think about religion in a new way. So thinking about what kind of mental models do religious people do to make these non-obvious beings more obvious. That
Yeah.
I just could not put the book down.
It's,
Absolutely fascinating.
yeah, I've not read that one, but I have read her other one on witchcraft. She developed the idea of epistemic drift,
Mm,
about how one can come to believe in magic even if one doesn't.
yeah.
Yeah, she's great. She's a really
Her other really good book is called When God Talks Back, and it's a anthropological study of evangelical Christians that talk about God talking to them. Oh, I feel very, called by God to go onto the mission field. That's a statement saying that God has kind of communicated to you. And so did an ethnographic study interviewing evangelical Christians and like, okay, when you say God called you to do this, what do you mean? And
right.
the book is called When God Talks Back. So like God is communicating with you. So really good anthropological study.
That's fantastic. Yeah. So there's a couple. Austin, I know we're coming down to about an hour, and so I'm gonna keep you longer than we need or should. But Austin Smith, as an aspiring psychedelic therapist, would you be comfortable in sharing a possible mystical psychedelic induced experience? Love you.
So I'm constantly intrigued by psychedelics. I'm like interested in the in trying, but I never have. So the short answer is no. Um, in terms of like the study of these experiences, I'm fascinated. So I said I have 35 video scripts written. One of them is on ayahuasca. So I have an ayahuasca video coming out. Again, couldn't put down the research. It was so fascinating. In terms of personal experiences, none to speak of, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I would say that I've tried psychedelic substances, and I've had mystical experiences on them, but they're the most like normie mystical experiences, like the oceanic feeling. I'm one with everything.
Hmm.
It's like sometimes I think to myself, that was I got robbed. Why couldn't I have the you
Something more
know
interesting that you could put
something more
down that.
interesting? It's just like the most boilerplate mystical experience.
Yeah.
But I think what's also interesting for me is that I don't I think sometimes people derive metaphysical claims from mystical experiences or any experience, and I'm very skeptical of that. I think metaphysics and experience are actually disparate,
Hmm.
that one does not inform the other, and that experience is highly unreliable.
Hmm.
So yeah, but that's mine. But it is an exciting field. I do think
Yeah.
that is an exciting field, and I think that it's really sad that the positive things we learned about psychedelic drugs in the 50s, it was just crushed by the government. And
Yeah.
yeah,
I feel like the needle's moving though. Like
yeah, it is.
Washington D.C. is kind of my home base, and I think D.C. recently legalized or at least decriminalized magic mushrooms. So
Ditto here. Yeah,
the
ditto here in Michigan.
the
So
needle is moving.
yeah, and I think yeah, and again, another place where we need religious studies scholars. Like
Yeah.
Notre Dame's doing the experiments with psychedelics and religion.
Yeah, Boston University, where I got my PhD, has a famous experiment that was done back in the 50s where they took a bunch of their divinity school students and put them in the basement of the church and
Mhm.
put them all on something. I forget what it was, LSD or something. And then they had like an Easter service up above, like
All
these
right.
booming organ. It was a very Protestant Easter service. And then they recorded like what did you experience? And for them it was this like deeply religious experience.
Right. The Good Friday experiment. It's the
Yeah.
most famous one, but it's like one data point, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like that's also a thing where people get really too enthusiastic about the possibilities of psychedelic.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's overread. Like, oh,
yeah,
the Book of Revelation was a guy on some sort of
yeah,
psychedelic trip. Like, or he
yeah.
was just like a very creative prophet. Like, you don't need that explanation.
Right. Yeah. I sometimes refer to that as psychedelic reductionism.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And I always talk about the DMT guy in my comments because there's always a DMT guy in my comments that no matter what
Mhm.
I'm talking about, Kabbalah, alchemy, it's like, yeah, it's DMT. I'm like,
Yeah. Yeah, it is
uh,
kind of like this panacea argument, like, oh, we can explain everything, including the origin of religion itself from
right.
psychedelics.
Yeah, I agree. Are there any connections between early Christianity and Orphism?
I don't know enough about Orphism to have a good answer to that. I will say early Christianity is it in many respects is a Roman religion that arose out of the Greco-Roman context. So everything that we see in like the cult of Mithras, I don't know what else, like even the imperial cult, we see influence in early Christianity. Everything down to like how liturgy is performed and which liturgical sayings they say. Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy, like is a imperial saying, like you would call the emperor Kyrie. So like everything, everything influenced everything.
Right. Yeah, I would say that. Yeah, I think that there's a sort of big, at least what I know of Orphism, and we only have one document maybe from the entire thing, and that's the Divinity Papyrus. Is that it's just hard to say. I mean, there's a common field of thinking, and especially like ontological or metaphysical speculation of the time, and I think some of that gets into Christianity, but that could just as well be coming from Philo in the end of the day.
Yeah.
This stuff is so overdetermined that the pointing to direct connections gets really, really hard, and that's why I think reductions are also just a mistaken way of doing things, because whatever the logos is for Christianity is a hyper overdetermined concept that's coming in from 50 directions, and saying, "Oh, it's only coming from Philo, only coming from this." I think it's intellectually untenable.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of hard to prove like genetic relationships between when it comes to influence, unless you see like actual, like this phrase was lifted from this liturgy. Like I try to look for more, going back to the idea of like high def evidence. Like otherwise we're just talking about general numinous influence, and you can almost make an argument for anything.
Right. And I think this is why I'm also comparative stuff can sometimes worry me, because just because two things look similar don't mean there's actually any connection.
Yeah.
People come to same conclusions all over the world. If there's a general Platonic well, and everyone in the ancient Near East, in the ancient Eastern Mediterranean basin is drawing from it, it's unsurprising you're going to get a bunch of similar things in different mystery religions or religion in general.
Yeah. I mean, this is why I'm skeptical of the whole dying and rising God thing. I'm like, okay, well, people die everywhere. So of course we're going to have this global humanity wide interest in not dying and rising again. So if we see this theme pop up, it's not because of like direct copying. It's just like a deep human need. In the same way we see mother goddesses around the world, because people have mothers. So like in my mind, I'm like, okay, that's I guess that God did die, but like, does that tell us anything interesting? Because like everybody dies, and we write our myths based on human experience.
Yeah, and it gets even worse with like older scholarship, like Mithraism. Just has such a bad situation with all this like made up stuff from the 19th century. Yeah. But yeah, I think we both made episodes on Mithraism, and just having to be like, oh yeah, no, Christianity is not just a version of Mithraism.
Yeah, I call it like parallelomania. So just find parallels everywhere, and I'm like, you can make anything seem parallel, but to actually prove like a direct influence, I want to see like a direct quotation. So like Noah's Ark, Noah covering the ark in tar or bitumen or whatever that word is. It's like directly lifted from an earlier, myth that like the ark was covered in bitumen or something. So like that's direct influence. That word is lifted, but like otherwise, the flood being this like this pan humanity myth. I'm like, well, okay, because humans experience floods. It's not necessarily direct influence.
Right, I agree. Lindsay, Micey, $5 super chat. What was Bronze Age magic like? That's a huge question. Any favorite Bronze Age?
I mean, you're asking a medieval historian and a late Roman historian about the Bronze Age. So short answer is this is way outside my field. Let me just think real briefly. Like, I don't know if I know much about Bronze Age magic.
Yeah, I mean, as much as it is magic, I think the Maklu ritual, it's kind of an anti-magic magic that was performed in the Assyrian ancient Near Eastern context. That's a kind of a cool Bronze Age ritual, but is it magic? Yeah,
I guess I know a little bit more about Iron Age, because you have like the Israelite pillar figurines that are kind of like these female figurines holding up their breasts. There's arguments that those are apotropaic objects, to keep evil spirits away. That's more Iron Age, though. Yeah. I just think the pillar figurines are interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I will say that maybe this is also Iron Age, but the little amulets that were found in Jerusalem, right? The Ketif and Om amulets that have the earliest part of the Birkat Choranim, the priestly benediction. I think what's fascinating about that, those are almost certainly some kind of protection amulets for the dead. They were found in graves. And I think it's interesting that the kind of thing that the Bible probably would have prohibited is the earliest example of a document from that text or that collection of text. It's just,
that's what you call
I
ironic.
love I love the irony of that. The irony of and I've been to Katifa and you walk around this ancient Judean graveyard and you're like, the first thing we have is the thing that would have been prohibited. I don't know. Yeah. I love that. Just a couple more. Thank you so much for the super chat, Mark. Big supporter of the channel, shining a light in the darkness. Not only me, man, but you all helping to support us and support folks like Andrew. Also say, Andrew, you have a goal for your Patreon, right? It's in your video, you're trying to get to 1,000 by the end of the year.
Yeah. So my goal for 2021 was to get to 700 because it was the 7th year. It's like the Jubilee of religion for breakfast. So 700 patrons was the goal, and we reached it like before the clock ran out on 2021. So the new goal is 1,000 patrons by the end of 2022. And with that added Patreon support, I'm able to do like much more ambitious series. So a lot of my videos are just one-off or really short series. Like my Confucianism series was 3 episodes because some of these topics are just so big. But for Hinduism and Islam, like these are huge topics that I have not covered enough on the channel. So I'm like going big. I'm doing like 10 episodes minimum per series. I'm hiring scholars of Islam and scholars of Hinduism to write the episodes as consultants. So that's kind of the real lofty goal, is to try to get these big series off the ground.
Yeah, and again, folks, I'm sure that most people here who are subscribed to Esoterica also subscribe to Andrew. But I will say, not just to go subscribe if you're not, but take a look at his Patreon. I really do think that supporting public intellectuals is important. I support people on Patreon that I value. I support Angela and Zevi because I really do admire their scholarship and what they're doing as public intellectuals and educators. So would you buy us a beer? Would you buy us a cup of coffee if you ever met us? If the answer to that is yes, if you appreciate our work enough to buy us a cup of coffee or a beer, or you can kind of, would you do that every month? And if the answer is yeah, and if you think what we're doing is worthwhile, then $2, $3, $4, $5 a month to help us continue doing what we're doing is essential. It's essential to this whole process, and it sort of feels gross to say it, but we got to eat, got to keep the lights on.
Yeah. And for me, it's like, are we providing value? And I feel like we are providing value, which is, really rigorous peer-reviewed research on religious studies. And, YouTube pays us maybe 0.0001 cent for the click when you clicked on watched our video. So even like a $1 per month is like hundreds of times leveraged support of the channel.
Definitely. And the whole, value added. Also, I will say this: it's not only just value added, but also we're saving y'all money. You don't have to go to Egypt and Amsterdam and get student loan debt, or or even the process for applying for a postdoc. Andrew, I'm sure no part of the background of what we do is fun in many ways. And so it's also, I think what's really great about what we do is that we provide a situation where we're able to give access to information that people can access at any time, and they can access it for free and without having to go into debt or even walk into the classroom. So it's also saving money, I think, in some ways.
Yeah, and this is what I love about YouTube is a search engine. So if you have a question about Valentinian Gnosticism, you can type that in. What is Valentinianism? And I think that makes it unique, even compared to TikTok and Instagram and Twitter. I see YouTube as like this particularly powerful platform for public education because of the search query. So
it's
like
the second biggest search engine in the world.
Yeah,
I think that and also, folks, I mean, another way of putting that is, if folks like Andrew and I aren't producing high quality scholarly material,
who will be? Yeah.
Who will be? And I tell you what does get produced is not high quality. It is not scholarly. It is it's pretty scary stuff. So so that's just a shout out to support our work and other scholars that you appreciate on those platforms. But Andrew, I want to thank you again for coming on the channel, for working together in this cool collaboration on something we both have a shared interest in. And again, for being such a trailblazer to setting the way so that other folks can follow in the same path and do some of the same kind of work. And I really want to wish you just so much appreciation for what you do.
Yeah, thank you so much for the collab. It was a lot of fun, and thanks for inviting me on the show.
Absolutely. Andrew, I'm gonna let you sign off. I might stick around just for a few more minutes if folks want, just to answer the last couple of questions, but feel free to take off, Andrew, if you want or need to. And I might just take a couple more questions as they go. But
All right. Take
all
care,
right.
everyone.
Yeah, thank you, man. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'll take a couple more questions. I have just about maybe 15 more minutes. If folks have any other questions that are specific to me, I'm going to be doing just an Esoterica live stream here probably in 2 weeks. But I'm on here and I don't have to do anything for the next 15 minutes. So I thought might as well grab some just last questions if folks want them. What is the most recent? I think Brent. What is the most recent founded religion that academics study in a serious way? I would say QAnon. QAnon probably is probably the most recent religion that's developed, way of being religious that's developed, and definitely there are people out there studying QAnon in a rigorous academic way. So that I think it would be QAnon. But yeah, there's lots of other religions that are relatively new that get studied academically. Of course, Wicca is studied academically. That's relatively recent since since the mid 20th century. But UFO religion also, Raelianism, things like that also get studied. So have I covered the Lama yet? I've not covered the Lama, although Angela's doing sort of a marathon. We have these marathon sessions going on Seekers of Unity where he's using where Zevi's really doing deep dive on Maimonides, and Angela's over at Angela's Symposium is doing a deep dive on Aleister Crowley. And so yeah, so that's there. Angela's doing that. I do want to do some episodes on Thelema. I just need to get my Thelema chops up a little higher. I've been reading some of the holy books of Thelema and reading the really great Kaczynski biography of Crowley and things like that. So I want to get my Thelema chops a little tighter. And I do eventually want to do one. I was going to do an episode on the Book of the Law this year, but then I chickened out because I was like, I still don't know it well enough. And who knows the Book of the Law well enough? So I'm going to have to do that eventually. No, I think Brent. Oh, I think I got your question. Excuse me. So let's see here. Oh, wow, there's a lot of questions coming in. See some other stuff coming in. Wow. The Book of the Law is pretty opaque. That's one way of putting it. No. Will I cover the Talmud? Yes, I talk about the Talmud all the time. Yep, I'll definitely get to the Talmud eventually. Let's see here. Pre-Islamic Persian magic. Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know much about pre-Islamic Persian magic at all. So that'd be cool to get a scholar on to do that. I also saw someone ask about Buddhist magic. I would like to also do something on Buddhist magic, but I'm not an expert in Buddhism, so I would bring someone to help me write that content. But yeah, that's a whole world. Maybe Caitlin knows more about that. Just esoteric Buddhism in general, Shingon Buddhism is just terribly interesting. So I'd love to do something like that. Any future videos on, let's see here. Any future videos on Sumerian, Akkadian, Elamite religions? Not those particularly. I do want to do something about those, and I'm only an amateur of that stuff. What I do want to eventually do is do an episode here pretty soon on Ugaritic religion. Folks may know that at Ugarit, Bronze Age site north of ancient Israel, or what would become ancient Israel. It's well before it, but we have a huge amount of literature from ancient Ugarit, and we have a good bit of religious literature that's localized mostly to the king and the temple cult there. But it's one of our best insights into Bronze Age religion of the Levant. And so we're going to be doing an episode on that. It's a good magical text and stuff in there. So yeah, definitely going to be doing something like something on that kind of stuff. All right. Will I do an episode on the book, the 6th and 7th book of Moses? Yeah, that's a super important text as well in the history of magic. It's a little later, but yeah, I will be doing it, and I think it also had a huge impact on religion and the Caribbean religion and stuff like that. So there's a lot of like interesting impact on those books as well. So yeah, definitely we'll be doing something on the sixth and seventh book of Moses. Oh, wow, thank you so much for the super chat. Lindsay, I'm sorry we didn't have a better answer for you on the magic. But if you can shoot me a comment on the most recent video, I can give you the title of that book and the ISBN about the definition of magic from earlier, and the book that sort of goes through lots and lots and lots of definitions of magic. It's a great book, and I'm happy to pass that along. But thank you so much for your support of the channel. Yeah, Ugaritic stuff is super fascinating. I really find they don't get, for whatever reason, the Ugaritic civilization doesn't get the same play as the Akkadian, like Babylon and Assyria, and ditto with the Hittites. Right, the Hittites are some of the most interesting people of that region. One of the reasons why they're super interesting is because they're Indo-Europeans. Like these are Indo-European. This is a Hittite is the earliest attested Indo-European language, and it's a fascinating group of people that for whatever reason they just don't get the same kind of, and Troy was probably part of the Hittite Empire, but they don't get the same attention that ancient Egypt does or other places. And so I'm really interested in ancient Hittites, ancient Ugarit, and those kinds of more minority or lesser known groups don't get the same attention as the Sumerians for whatever reasons. People were, they're interested in the Sumerians for obvious reasons because they're kind of the first. But yeah, the Elamites, and other people that are really, 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 really interesting. So those are ancient peoples that I would love to get to. All right, let's see. Oh yeah, the Luwians. Yeah, the Luwians are also interesting. They had a hieroglyphic script, hieroglyphic Luwian. Also super fascinating. All those guys are interesting. The Hittites are more interesting to me just for the linguistic angle. I love how they proved. That Indo-Europeans, Pi folks, Proto-Indo-European folks, they speculated about the certain kinds of sounds made in Proto-Indo-European. They're like, we think there are these three sounds that are going to be in Indo-European or Proto-Indo-European, and they couldn't find any evidence to them. And then, bam, there they basically all three of them were in Hittite, which is just like, I just love when stuff like that happens. Like, it just shows how much of a science linguistics really is. And I just really love how much, like, when stuff like that happens, I just love it. I just love it. All right, folks, let me check the time. I have a few more minutes. I gotta go get my children from their respective schools and go get my children from their respective schools and get ready for Shabbat. So I think I might just scroll up randomly and get one more question, so I'm not getting just the people left behind, and do one more, and then I'm going to have to jump out. Oh, here we go. This is a great one. Solomonic magic. So, who is to consider magic as purely evil? Isn't Solomon said to have practiced occult sciences and magic as he possessed and controlled demonic entities in Abrahamic religion? This is a great place where it shows you where the lines of this stuff get really blurry, right? That there's a very blurry line between what is accepted and what isn't, and usually what it isn't accepted or what's liminal gets labeled magic, whereas other things that are more acceptable are labeled religion. And I say labeled because the people doing Solomonic magic may consider it, and very likely do consider it, part of their spiritual practice. So yeah, this whole idea that magic is inherently evil, it's a very, I think, a very Christian kind of way of framing both what magic is, right, and really coming out of the Inquisition and the witch hunting movement, and framing what magic is and imposing that upon other peoples or ancient peoples. And I think that it's just a category error, and that we don't understand magic best by taking conceptions of it that don't apply and then applying them to other people. So I think that what's the better thing to do with magic, if you want to have a really good definition of magic, right, is to put it into the very specific instance that you're studying and say, what is magic in this instance? What do I mean by magic in this instance? And then I think you're much more or much less likely to make serious category errors. And so then you begin to get into how to think about that, as opposed to being, well, magic is just evil religion. Let's go look at aberrant religion everywhere, and that's what magic is. I think you're going to make some very some pretty serious theoretical mistakes in the study of magic. But yeah, you can read the Testament of Solomon. It's a fun book. It's weird. It reads like a lot of those sort of late classical, early medieval romances. It's super weird, but a lot of fun. I love all the stories about Solomon and the Talmud and stuff. He's just an interesting character in terms of I don't know. I always like him because he's super smart and always up to no good. I just kind of like him. Um, I kind of like him. So, all right, folks. Well, I have to jump off. I just wanted to be able to take a couple more questions, and I knew there was one extra one in the live, and I wasn't able to get it. But but I just want to say again, thank you everybody for hanging out today. It's really great to hang out with Religion for Breakfast. Andrew's a great guy and he does great work, and I'm really grateful for him and the work he does. And of course, also really grateful for all of y'all in the chat who've hung out with he and I today, and who make this possible. Right, you guys make all this stuff possible, and I really deeply appreciate your support of the channel, your support of Andrew's channel, your support of the work that we all do to try to bring this information in a scholarly and reliable way to you all. And you deserve to have access to great information, and I always hope that we're doing right by you all in providing it. So thank you so much for supporting us, making what we do possible. We're really grateful for it. So, all right, folks, I'm gonna go get my kids and start winding things down for Shabbat. So I don't know if folks here observe the Sabbath. I hope you get some rest, and if you don't observe the Sabbath, I hope you still get some rest. Everybody deserves some rest. We all deserve to take a day off, and I hope you take care of yourself and love those that love you. So thank you again so much for hanging out with me. There'll be an actual Just Esoterica live stream in a couple of weeks, so check back in a couple of weeks for that. But until then, I hope everybody's doing well, and thank you so much. And I hope everyone has a great weekend, a great night, and a great couple of weeks. So thank you so much.